sure you're in tune. So kind of jumping to the next one, as Sean had mentioned, we have the Institute of Natural Resources. Sean is here, and Mirka McCune's been helping us out as well. And I just wanted to let everyone know about that support, what we have for the development of the strategy. Kind of three objectives that we've been looking at and having INR help us out with. And it's a near-term GIS support and mapping product. So a lot of the stuff that we're looking at has really been put together from an INR, which we really appreciate. And then also starting to scope the design of a more robust, longer-term decision support. And Sean's going to facilitate that conversation today. So really appreciate that as well. And then the last piece of that is really supporting us with scientific input and in the development of the strategy. And we want to make sure that we're hitting that, and having Sean and INR helping us out with that is really good, and really happy to have that resource. So I just wanted to let people know as we're seeing Sean joining us and been helping out with other groups as well, and once again, just appreciate that help. Something else I wanted to just kind of update folks on is within the development of the strategy, also working on getting the tribal liaisons with the agencies together. We've been working with the tribal liaisons from the 3 federal and the three state agencies to really do introductions and inform each other of what's going on within the strategy development and getting everyone up to speed. So really starting to kick that off, which is really good. And really the goal there is functional process and approach to engage with the tribes moving forward, both short-term and long-term. We've had mechanisms where there's been engagement with the sovereign nations, but kind of a more robust engagement is what we're talking about for kind of short-term and long-term. So wanted just to hit on that. Something else I want to hit on too is Washington DNR. We've been talking a lot about Washington DNR and their process. And one thing we're doing there is working with Washington DNR to try to get a presentation together of the work that they had done and looking at scheduling that, and of course inviting you all and also the Agency Coordination Implementation Group. Working with Andrew Spades right now to kind of figure out the logistics of that. So expect an email here in the near future, and it's an opportunity for us to get together and really hear their process, what was good, what was bad, and kind of how they're moving forward with the the implementation of that strategy. So really excited about that opportunity, and hopefully getting that on the calendar here pretty soon. So we'll be sending you that here shortly. Just kind of a few more updates. SageCon, I know in the past we've talked a lot about not quite, we have a very forest-centric group and lacking in range. Really happy to have Katie here. Really appreciate you joining, and John. But we've also been having good conversations with SageCon, how to better link ourselves with SageCon and looking at the range aspect of the all-land strategy and going through some different conversations there. And once again, with INR helping out, is pulling in some of their data as well of what they're looking at for prioritization and restoration, et cetera. And we'll show some of that here in a little bit. But I did want to say loud and clear, right? Or heard the feedback in pulling in SageCon, and there's some really good conversations, and hopefully hear more in the future on that. Two other things I want to hit on too. Some of you may or may not seen it, but we've been working with OSU E.J. Davis, and we put out what we're calling a qualitative capacity assessment, trying to understand the capacity kind of gaps and needs, and that was sent to collective action groups. That survey was, and that's local partnerships and collaboratives, and trying to understand where all the different groups that exist, what they're doing, and what are the needs and opportunities for accomplishing landscape resiliency and risk reduction. So once again, having E.J. Davis help support this work too has been quite pleasant as well, and kind of some updates on that. That survey was sent on November 28th and closing December 23rd, so here pretty shortly. So hoping to get some of those results here and bringing some of that information to us in the new year. So once again, kind of talk about the whole work streams. We'll go over that again, but how that fits in the capacity and readiness of what we're looking at with the strategy. So and next steps on that one is I'm really working hard to develop a long-term engagement plan with the local collaborators and partnerships. Obviously a challenge, there's a lot of groups out there, but how do we start looking at regionally and bringing in some of this work with those groups? And we have a lot of good work that's going on there, and I'm just really trying to connect that. So once again, that's the very beginning stages, but we're hoping to have some more in-depth conversations with those regional groups at the new year as well. So, and then the last thing I wanted to inform, regional information webinar. Tomorrow, we're doing a 60-minute presentation sent to those collective action groups of the 20-year strategy of kind of where we are and providing some updates and overview background to those groups as well as once again, there's a lot going on, so we just want to provide that information and gain some feedback and talk about what is the future looking for those groups. So I just rattled off a lot of information. I apologize. Hopefully you see value in it, but I think it's really important to keep everyone informed of all the pieces that are going on because there is a lot of good work that's going on, et cetera. So any questions on that or thoughts? I'll just leave it open for a minute before we transfer into the next section of the agenda. All right. I will once again say if there are any questions outside of the group, always feel free to reach out. Happy to have a conversation at any point, but I just wanted to inform you of those steps that are going on. But going into the main event of today, once again, kind of the way we're going to do this is a lot of good work's been going on. We want to present that work and gain your feedback. So as we present some of this and have some conversations is really important to us. So I'll give kind of a quick overview of some of the stuff we've been talking about, and then I'm going to pass it off to Sean for a 15-minute conversation about long-term decision support, and we'll go from there. So real quickly here. All right, so just to express here, this is our fourth meeting. I just want to also mention everyone, I've said it a few times, but the webpage has all the old PowerPoints on there. So we try to make these PowerPoints that you can look back and hopefully easy to read. But we went through welcome, agenda review, and updates. And once again, I want to just look at our task. Are they able to see their faces? So looking at our task, a 20-year strategic plan that prioritizes restoration actions and geographies for wildfire risk reduction and use of direct federal, state, and private investments in a tangible way. That's what was in Senate Bill 762 and really rooted in the shared stewardship MOU. We've talked about that quite a bit, but I think it's always good to review that. And once again, the steps that we go through over the next hour and a half, how we're really targeting that. Looking back at our timeline, really following that timeline that we've laid out, we went into that phase one, which was building the foundation. And over the last 6 months, we've been working really hard on compiling information and gathering feedback. So this is kind of the last of what we're looking at phase two and the compiling the information. And then we're going to jump into phase three, which is drafting the plan. So once again, on our agenda, we're going to talk about timeline January to June, which is at phase three, and what are some touch points with this group and other groups along the way. So Dan's going to facilitate that conversation to start looking at phase three and starting to put all this together. And looking at this graphic we presented a little while ago was the work streams, how we're putting this together and how they all fit together. And just a reminder that we've been really focusing on these areas in red, and we're going to talk about quite a few of these. And then how does that feed into our priority restoration actions and geographies, and that capacity and readiness needs. And then moving into phase three, looking at the SMART goals, the metrics, the accountability, the financial implementation plan, et cetera. So just a reminder of really been following that timeline and also following these work streams, and we're going to hit on quite a few of those as we've been essentially broke this beast out and looking at individual pieces. So. And really what I want to get on to is, as I transfer this over to Sean, who will take over, once again, the language talks about prioritizing restoration actions and geographies for wildfire risk reduction. And conversations we've had in the last meetings was talking about short-term and then also long-term. And the longer-term decision supports, Sean's going to go ahead and facilitate this next conversation. So. We're going to go ahead and stop sharing, and Sean, if you want to take over from there, it's all you, and thank you.
All right, thanks, Nathan. Okay, as Nathan said, I'm going to talk about this topic of longer-term decision support, and really put it in the context of this kind of a bit larger concept that was put forward in the Wildfire Strategy Framework document of a science and resource assessment facility. As Nathan mentioned, I'm with the Institute for Natural Resources, and we were established by the Oregon legislature in 2001 to provide integrated access to natural resource information for decision making. And we built a few tools related to that, including the Oregon Explorer, which is just kind of a general catalog of resources related to natural resources information in Oregon. A few more specific tools like the Community Wildfire Planning Tool, and Nathan was talking about SageCon a bit. We've built a SageCon landscape planning tool for them. And we've also done some science synthesis work. In 2016, we did this independent science reviews document for the legislature, looking at that concept and how it might be implemented in Oregon. Other reviews like the Trees to Tap, looking at forest and water relationships in Oregon. So just looking back now at the shared stewardship MOU that was kind of the foundation for a lot of this work, this initiative. They talked about using adaptive management, talked about tracking the best available science and how it's constantly evolving, and had a goal there of developing a science-based and tractable monitoring and accountability approach for the shared stewardship strategy. Building on this, here's the graphic from the framework document that was prepared to kind of flesh out the ideas in the MOU. And there's a variety of groups that were described in there. I'm going to focus on this one box here that's highlighted, and that's the Scientific and Resource Assessment Group. In that framework document, there were kind of a few ideas related to science in there, related to this SARA concept. One, that it would be provide data aggregation and also provide the best available science to the groups involved. It would respond to requests for information by the ASEG and other groups involved. And it would be comprised of scientific experts that would be appointed depending on the resource subject in question. So from that, I just distilled two kind of general categories of support. One is data management and analysis. And we've already seen some of the work we've been doing there on prioritization of geographies. Another thing that would fall under there would probably be this kind of cooperative monitoring objective of trying to figure out collective impact among the agencies on wildfire and restoration. And then the second big kind of bucket is science synthesis. How do we find and synthesize the science out there for use in our adaptation and mitigation actions? So looking at the data analysis and support piece, here's just a few initial proposed concepts. We've talked some about decision support systems. And I put that in quotes because given the diversity of initiatives and objectives involved in wildfire and landscape resilience work, it just seems at this point there's not, we don't want to try to focus on a single tool or approach. Rather, we want to try to build a broader system for sharing data, different analytical approaches, products produced by different organizations, and on an ongoing basis. And so that's, to me, more of a clearinghouse type activity rather than what people may envision as a decision support system. Another thing that's come up in some of our groups is an alternative for that acronym of DSS, and that is a discussion support system. That we really want to harness this information and science to facilitate discussions between agencies and the organizations involved. We want to try to find out how organizations are using information now to make their decisions and share that with each other. Hopefully that will lead to more opportunities for harmonization over the longer term and cooperation. And then we've also got the other, not only across organizations, but across scales is another challenge we face. We are starting with looking at prioritization at the state scale, but we know ultimately that has to work its way down to the local scale to be implemented. And then the last kind of piece there is concept there is it's a collaboration support system. So rather than trying to build up one analytical team at an organization like INR, it seems like it would be better to try to build up more of a coordination facility that draws expertise from other organizations as needed, depending on the issue at hand. Then a few concepts, possible initial concepts in the terms of science support, really fairly similar to what I just went over. Again, there's this just enormous diversity of topics that are related to wildfire and landscape resilience. So, you know, one concept is rather than trying to get one group of scientists together to be the team that kind of supports this effort, could we build something that's more of a coordinating facility that brings in different folks, again, as needed for the issue being addressed? And also that the groups involved are going to need different levels of analysis and on different timelines. Sometimes, you know, a quick turnaround is needed, and I'm phrasing that here as a desk study. So something that could be done by a single person or a small group of coordinated people on kind of a short timeline. Other times, we're going to be addressing big, knotty issues that, you know, you can't ask one person to summarize effectively. There's going to have to be debate and debate within the science community. And so for that, I'm calling that a science consultation, and that would be more of a facilitated discussion among scientists and practitioners involved. So how do we realize this? How do we actually operationalize this? That, of course, is going to be difficult. It's hard enough to get one organization to function effectively, but to try to do coordination between different organizations is always a challenge. What I'm proposing here as initial concept is perhaps the small group of support staff at INR could help manage some of these coordination functions. We've already begun cataloging some of the data and tools out there. We could help with facilitation of communications. Some of the administrative tasks like recruitment of participants, contracts management, peer review, if that's requested, could happen from a small central support group. But really execution of the science here, it seems like has to draw again on all the participants, all the organizations and stakeholders that we have in wildfire and landscape resilience work in Oregon. Some kind of technical needs I wanted to run by you folks just in case you have any experience or ideas you could contribute here from the organizations and coalitions you've worked with. You know, we'll need to do things like track requests, right? You know, what is the request coming from the ASIG? What's the timeline they need? Who are the personnel they've recommended to be involved? We've talked a fair amount about data and tools. You know, how do we track what's available out there and make that kind of more widely available and accessible to all the stakeholders? How do we track the expertise if we're going to bring scientists together around certain themes? You know, we'll want to try to track the expertise that's out there and available. Again, communications mechanisms is a big piece of this, I think. How do we help people communicate and track these processes through time? And, you know, with any science, obviously literature is important. So how do we track the available literature out there and tie that to the themes we're interested in? I just started to put a few things out there on the right side, but we've really got to do a lot more development there. And that's in terms of what examples are out there we could draw on these technical needs. So I really appreciate any input you folks have on that now or later. There's also, we've started looking at some more kind of scientific support examples. You know, here in Oregon, for the Oregon Plan on salmon and watersheds, for a number of years, we had what's called the Independent Multidisciplinary Science Team. So that's one example of how science support was provided. Washington is part of their Forests and Fish initiative. They have something called the Cooperative Monitoring, Evaluation, and Research Committee, a fairly kind of complex group of organizations. You can see on the diagram on the right side, a lot of different acronyms, but that's another example of we could look at to see what their successes and challenges have been. California Board of Forestry has an effectiveness monitoring committee. The National Power and Conservation Council has a science committee. Puget Sound Partnership, a big collaboration of over 700 organizations in the Puget Sound region, has a way of that they've organized their science and data support. And we're also starting here, INR is going to be hosting a science support facility for the Oregon Private Forest Accord that was recently agreed to in Oregon. And again, you know, I'd really like to solicit your experiences and examples you may know about cooperation, information sharing, science delivery, both within organizations and especially between organizations. Some review aspects we're thinking about is, you know, what are the origin and purpose of these different science support initiatives? What were their responsibilities and kind of products that were expected from them? Where did they receive direction? Who was in charge of them? Who was, you know, kind of asking for the different science syntheses? How were they organized? How were participants selected? How did workflow, you know, where did the budget come from? And then, you know, what information sources do we have about these? So again, appreciate any examples there. And just kind of summarizing the concepts here I presented, you know, Sarah as more of a coordination administrative mechanism rather than a particular team or one facility. Tries to inventory and build on existing efforts, really spends a lot of time trying to facilitate communication between organizations so we can draw the best expertise we have across the state and beyond as needed for specific objectives. So that's all I've got for the presentation, and want to open it up for discussion, questions. Really welcome your input. I see a hand from Joseph.
Yeah, I just wanted to break the ice for you.
Thank you.
One of the things I was curious about with this data coordination is I've noticed a lot of, we have a lot of different owners, right? There's the Forest Service and BLM and private owners. And even on the private lands, there's a lot of different funding sources and there's just not a lot of tracking of implementation, right? Even the Forest Service sometimes gets confused about which acres they've mechanically thinned versus burned. Sometimes they count them twice or whatever. And so I was just curious if you would see this as a way to coordinate and standardize data sets. And with some qualitative information about the treatments that are going to move forward, and knowing, how if those treatments actually got carried out, if they were just planned, did the full suite of treatments get carried out, and then, maybe some idea of how long they might last, when we might have to go back again. So would you see that as a role of Sarah?
Yeah, I think that's certainly been expressed in the senior leadership group and the agency coordinating group. It was in the MOU there, is, they want develop some sort of way of tracking collaborative impact over the landscape. But it's going to be a big job, obviously. If agencies are individually challenged to do that, it's going to be a big challenge to further coordinate that. But that is certainly one of the major intentions of this. Let's see. I think I saw Dylan's hand second.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks for the comments and the presentation on this stuff. As we were going through this, my only caution on this stuff, Sean, is feeling that I don't want to over-engineer this thing. Like, I definitely appreciate how much science is out there and how many processes exist in trying to bring these together in one place. But I think some of the stuff that Joseph was talking about there kind of highlights the challenges that we already have about a lot of these systems, and even, the tracking on this. And I don't want to create a whole bunch of these additional frameworks and processes. We get trapped in this kind of infinite, unending science and review feedback loop. And the more that we broaden this out and add additional entities and tools into this, we're constantly scrambling to update those, to make sure we've consulted with everyone, that they've provided feedback, and it just stretches us out in a way that makes this politically unfeasible to be able to deliver on a product that can be actionable. So, I'm not saying that we're not using the tools before us to develop, what we need as far as a 20-year plan, and that, we're not engaged in transparency, but I want to make sure that we are ultimately tying this back to, something that is tangible, that people can see, that they can use, and is regularly updated. But that idea of a map and a prioritization process that people can look at and they can understand investments and track those investments. So, from a decision support standpoint and a science support standpoint, I like all this. I just want to make sure that this doesn't put us in a position where it can't be updated and we can't use it on a regular, consistent, and expedient basis. I also worry about cost, right? You put all these pieces in there and you're constantly adding these components. Who's maintaining these? Do we have the staffing for it? And do we have the funding for it? We're going to keep coming back to that. So those would just be some cautions, I guess I would add on this as we think about expanding the scope of what we're trying to deliver here as far as the final product.
Yeah, great comments. And I would see this as being a very incremental process of trying to add value, to see where we can add value, rather than coming in and trying to build something large from the get-go that, like you say, would be difficult, time consuming to build, and even more difficult to maintain. Great. Oriana?
Yeah, so I think the point that I want to make is that data is complicated for many communities on a couple of levels. One is that the representation of data can have impacts for communities, and I'm thinking specifically about the wildfire maps and some of the unintended consequences related to insurance and just what that means for a lot of communities, that it's valuable to map things, but we also have to think about what the impact of mapping things is and how that gets received. And to that end, I agree with the comments about kind of the weightiness of doing this work and the potential cost. But I think one of the most important checks and balances in any data collection process is community, and ensuring that there are community and local voices that are helping to engage with data, vet data, and help identify what the impacts may be of sharing certain kinds of data. So I'm curious to know more about how like community sourced data and community evaluated data factors into this process.
Yeah, good points and good concerns. And I don't have a good answer for you at this point in terms of community source data. We've talked a little bit about the general data sets that are out there in terms of the social vulnerability index. But that's a very, it's fairly aggregated. And we don't, it's very good points. We don't really have a strategy at this point for engaging local communities with the priority maps that we've created to date. The state WUI map was kind of sent back for more engagement. So that's a process that's happening right now. That's a bit outside of what we're working on at the moment. I don't know if Nathan or Dan might have anything else to say about that engagement piece. Okay, well, it's good for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I would just throw out here too, just for time check too, that kind of a transition, because some of the conversation too is about short-term mapping, and that's what we're going to get into next year too. So I guess I would just throw out any last comments, and then we'll transition to Dan, but really appreciate the feedback.
I can hold my question until Dan presents his piece. I have some questions sort of along the lines of what Dylan was asking about, but happy to hold that until we get our next presentation under our belt. Okay,
thank you. And then just the last, kind of wrapping it up too, we've heard from that, excuse me, from that senior leadership group, just the idea of decision support, and then the tracking, and then the dashboard, right? And showing the stuff externally of what have we been doing, and how are we getting over the next 20 years. So I think part of wrapping that into is the challenges of collecting that data and then displaying that externally is something that was talked about quite a bit. So really appreciate that. And then Dan, I'll go ahead and transition to you if you want to go, and then kind of keep the conversation going.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I mean, I appreciate the comments. I didn't have any sort of response except to Oriana's comment, except to say that it's an issue that we should explore more. So so appreciate that. That's exactly what we wanted to talk with you about and get your input, feedback on, so that we're sort of tracking these issues that we may not be thinking about initially. And in that spirit, what we have done all along here is sort of give you our current thinking based on whatever level we're at, and with the idea of getting your feedback to refine and improve upon it. And that's also going to be true of this presentation around near-term priorities. And I wanted to go second after Sean, because Sean is going to presented this idea of like, how do we sort of address the longer term. And now we're going to focus in on essentially, where do we prioritize investments in the initial 1 to 3 years, which is to say sort of where do we draw the boundaries for priority areas when we produce the document in June of 2023, so essentially in about 6 months, right? Recognizing that that is going to change and evolve over time. So it's really just for the initial sort of 1 to 3 years until that longer term sort of decision support system gets up and running, and we can use it to make future decisions. So we showed you last time a set of initial maps that Einar had created, Mirka had created those, and we just started sort of looking at them. We looked at them with you. We got some feedback from you on that, and over the course of the last month, we've been playing with them and sort of learning much more about them, and then also thinking about, what is it that we need to be focusing in on. And so, there's a lot of ways of thinking about our priorities. It could be wildfire risk, it could be restoration need, it could be social vulnerability or other values. We also had put together these strategic elements. And the first one is wildfire risk to communities, but it's sort of, you can read this as being equal to to all these others as well. And the question was, which one is more important? So we put that question actually, or are they all equally important? And we put that question to the strategic leadership group, and the response back was wildfire risk is the most important thing. And this is essentially some of the things that they told us. The reason for our existence is to treat areas of high fire risk. And we are here because of the wildfire threat. And that was sort of the direction that we took. In that meeting, there were also comments that agencies will have independent priorities as well as shared priorities. We have to understand that, the way I took that was in some ways, what we're trying to do here is concentrate or guide the development of priorities towards these priority areas, toward the investments towards the priority areas, recognizing that agencies will still have their existing independent priorities as well. And we should be targeting across boundary lines, so the sort of shared aspect of that, including private lands, finding ways to sort of engage private landowners. And then there's a comment that the MOU in 762 says to direct investments. And there was one comment that maybe what we should do is sort of soften that a bit to say guide investments rather than direct for this process. Again, these are all sort of just comments that were made that we're kind of working with, let's say. But that was, the top two is really sort of what we started thinking about. Okay, so that's our leader's intent. So with that information, we started looking at, how to sort of deal with that. And the 762 focuses us towards the 4 highest ENVC risk classes. And then we've also been playing with the forest disturbance restoration need from Ryan Haugo and Tom DeMeo and others who worked on this project. And then asking sort of other questions about other planned restoration areas or the range as well. How do we factor that in? And so what I want to show you now is some maps that have been put together over the course of the last month. And again, these are still for discussion and for exploration. We've made no decisions on this. We're really looking for input. And we'll get to some sort of pointed questions in a moment, but I wanted to show you first. So this is, the blue is the high wildfire risk, the 4 ENVC classes. The green is the high forest restoration need. And one of the questions, and then you can see sort of where it overlaps in the darker blue here. And one question that we've been kind of grappling with is, does this look right? Is it too much? Is it not enough of the landscape area? One of the comments that keeps coming up is, if you prioritize everything, you've prioritized nothing. And so one of the questions then becomes, so what is the right amount to prioritize? And I want to just really emphasize, we have not come to any conclusion on that. So one bit of analysis, we've got little bit more non-forested than forested area when you take all of this shaded area in, and that an overwhelming amount of it is federal and private, with very little bit tribal and state. So that's just data points essentially. We then started looking at wildfires, and what I'm going to show you is the recent wildfires, and then give you the full picture for the last 20 years. So this is 2016 to 2019 overlaid on those shaded areas. And then 2020, the interesting thing here is that in 2020, we had some large fires that extended beyond our kind of identified priority areas currently. And then 2021. And I show these in part because the recent fires are what are in people's minds, probably more so than the long term. This is the long term, 20 years from 2001 to 2021. What I find interesting, at least, is that for the most part, these are priority areas, or shaded areas, let's say, and the wildfires largely line up, with a few areas here missing, and also over here, and then over here where there's much less fire, even though it is shaded. So that's another set of data points. Now I wanted to add the rangeland restoration need, which is in yellow here. And you can see this comes from SageCon. And I actually don't know the sort of like underlying data for this. So if someone has a question of that, I'm going to pass it to Sean on that. This is restoration need, and then overlaying the fires on top of that for the past 20 years. Again, data point. So with all of that, we then had a recent conversation, I think it was just yesterday, with Ryan Haugo and a few others who put together the forest disturbance restoration need data. And we learned a few things about it, and Pete Caligari was in that conversation, as well as Sean and Mirica and myself and a few others. And what I wanted to sort of show you, what we learned is that there's various ways of slicing and dicing that data. The original that we've been showing you takes the restoration need and says if there's 25% or more restoration need in a HUC, I think it's HUC 10, then it gets shaded, and if not, then not. You can also do 33% and get far less. You can see where it drops out in certain areas up here. And so again, we're sort of struggling with sort of exploring this question of what is the right amount of restoration need if we're going to include that as well. And then what I wanted to just offer, and this is my last slide on this topic, and then I want to open it up for questions and discussion, really. So the observations that I took away, at least from the restoration data meeting that we had yesterday with Ryan Haugo, is that restoration needs and values really differ by serial class. And this was just focusing on the forested area. So the older serial classes, you might want to do things differently and maybe protect them a bit more than the younger ones, for example. There's also great differences between the wet forests, the dry forests, and the range, and you may want to think about those differently. And then, if we're thinking about the fire risk, the restoration, conservation, those could be sort of separate steps in the process. And then we also talked a little bit about Washington DNR, where they identified kind of large landscape areas, and then they sort of went in and did much more specific local level assessments, which is sort of similar to how we've been thinking about this, which is to say, identify large landscape areas and then work with local groups who are more familiar with the needs on the ground to figure out what specifically to do. So it's a little different, but also has a similarity to it. So I wanted to stop there. And with all that information, we're still digesting all of this. I'd invite Pete and Sean and others who are involved in this restoration data meeting to sort of share their thoughts on what they took away from that conversation yesterday, as well as all of us sort of thinking about the question of, what is the right area, the right geography? How do you even think about this with regard to the needs on the ground and our charge focusing on primarily wildfire risk reduction. So I'll stop and welcome comments. And I can't see hands, I don't think, very well here. So, oh, there I go now. Katie, you're the first one in my screen, so I'll ask you first.
Yeah, thanks. And sorry to those of you who got your hands up faster. So I wanted to check in this. In terms of wildfire risk on rangelands, I see that you used the 2018 QWRA, which did not analyze effects of wildfire on rangeland values. They are redoing this, and it sounds like you've been in touch with probably Megan Kreutzberg at SageCon and INR. And so I would, if we were to use something that's informed by the QWRA, in order for it to be relevant for rangelands, we would need to use the newest version. It's being updated and hopefully released this year. That's led by Andy McAvoy at OSU. So I wanted to make sure that we were all aware of that discrepancy. And then yes, it's coming. And then while I have the microphone, my other concern is, restoration on rangelands. We would need to really clearly define what we mean by that, because when it comes to the effects of wildfire on sagebrush rangelands, it really depends on abiotic and biotic conditions at a site. And so we have actually different data sources that could be a lot more insightful for us in terms of the effects of fire on the vegetation in those places, because right now there's not a whole lot of nuance. I mean, I appreciate this, but it's just, there are big chunks that need some kind of restoration, and it's very place specific, and it's also an extraordinarily dynamic among seasons. That's why it's like really tough and difficult from forests. And then the other bit is we don't have sagebrush rangelands in the northeastern corner. It's rangelands, but it's a different ecosystem. And so we would have to think hard also about inputs for that as well, because we haven't mapped kind of threats to those ecosystems in the same ways that we have for southeastern Oregon, primarily probability of transition to invasive annual grasses following fire. So this is my very hot take. Sorry to dump it all on you, but I would definitely be interested in diving more into this down the line.
That's great. Thank you, Katie. And Sean, I don't know if you want to speak at all to the data dates and opportunities for incorporating new information.
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely we would like to be able to incorporate that new quantitative risk assessment that's coming out. We're just hoping that timing works out there. Otherwise, we have to kind of figure out some proxy ways to better integrate the range values into this. Totally agree that they were not that well integrated into the 2018 version. In terms of the Northeast, yeah, we have taken an initial look at that and actually just updated the map of the probability of transition to annual grasses up there. So we should be able to integrate that into the next version of these maps. Right now, the map here is just the range stuff is just based on sage grouse core areas and opportunity areas. So it's fairly limited and fairly crude in terms of not differentiating much between those. So I think we can do a better job of that in the next round too.
Thanks, Sean. And yeah, I mean, I think once we start diving into this more deeply, we'll probably want to engage the people who know about this stuff more thoroughly. And so I think that'll be really helpful. So thank you. Susan Jane Brown, I've got you next, and then Amanda Sullivan after that.
Great, thanks. So this was really helpful, Dan. Thanks for putting this together. I guess I'd make 2 points. One is, although I know it can make a map pretty busy, an overlay of ownership would be helpful. Mostly to distinguish between federal lands and non-federal as a starting point, but obviously knowing what lands, what entity has a decision space around is pretty important as we're thinking about prioritization. Because, for example, we could prioritize all of the federal lands, but the state doesn't have anything much to do with that. That's up to the BLM and the Forest Service to take action, right? And vice versa. So if we prioritize a bunch of land that is actually, prioritize it for treatment, but it's non-industrial, privately owned, you're going to have different implementation issues or challenges with that. So having a sense of who owns this stuff, I think is important as we are figuring out decision space, both on the part of the state and of other landowners, recognizing, of course, that we are talking shared stewardship across all lands, all that kind of stuff. But I think having a sense of who owns what is going to be helpful as we move through a prioritization. And then the other thing that I would also suggest, because I've seen this map before, something very similar to it, I think another screen that is important is where existing funding is already in either short supply or not in short supply. So there are a couple of areas, and all of my friends in Bend in Southern Oregon have heard me say this before, there's already a lot of investment on the federal side coming in for those watersheds. And although having a lot of money to spend is a nice problem to have, if it can't be spent in those watersheds, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to continue putting money there as an initial investment, or maybe it does. But I think having that conversation about where there is existing investment is also pretty important to looking at prioritization, because if we've already, put a lot of money into particular areas, putting more money there is not going to get us more bang for our buck, unless money really is the limiting factor. My sense is right now that that's not the case. But I think having, a candid discussion about where investment from state and federal sources is right now in Oregon is going to be important information to have as we figure out where we want to invest initially, and a second or a third or a fourth round of investment moving forward.
That's great. Thank you, Susan. And on your last point, I'll just say one of the things we're doing right now is gathering up all of that investment information and trying to figure out a way to map it in a way that we can actually discern it on a map. So we're hopeful that we will be able to have and utilize that data in the near future to help us with some of the decisions we need to make. So thank you for that. Amanda, and then Joseph.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess, I'm not super familiar with the lead study that went into this around the restoration piece on the forest lands, the expanding our understanding of forest structural restoration needs for the Pacific Northwest. And so I guess when I think about this, I've been trying to go away from the language of restoration and go towards the language of resiliency and trying to develop resilient landscapes. Because when we're looking at restoration, we're looking backwards, which is not bad. But I want to make sure that we are thinking about the needs moving forward of the landscapes as well, and really auguring into that rather than trying to restore to a historic environment, you know, that's out there. And so kind of auguring in a little bit to what Katie was saying on the rangelands, I think it's similar on the forest lands where, you know, obviously what's needed for landscape resiliency in the face of wildfire and the situation that we're in and climate change and all the others. A lot of what we used to have is good, but it's kind of like that when, right? That restoring to when there, you know, weren't English settlers and others here, and there was a lot of wildfire and there was a heck of a lot less forest, because that's different than restoring to some other you know, environmental class and sterile class out there. So I just want to be really like eyes wide open about that. And again, I just don't know the data and the data source and kind of what the parameters were as far as, you know, restoration and break from the historic environment out there. So I guess when we're talking about this on what's on the screen right now, the 25% or 33%, I don't know what 100% would look like. And I don't know what 0% would look like on that range. So I guess that's my only concern with this. And so it's hard to kind of figure out in my mind where to go, because I don't really know what restoration looks like and what the desired condition is on the ground within that data source.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll just note, I appreciate the sort of clarifying the distinction between restoration and resilience and reminding ourselves of what our goal is and the words that we choose. We're using restoration because that's sort of the term that was used in the study that led to the data that is such, but I think you're absolutely right that we should be thinking about it in a very different way towards the end goal. And it's something to keep in mind as we sort of apply this data or some understanding of this data so that we get the outcomes we actually want. So appreciate that. Joseph?
Thanks. Yeah, some great comments there. I had a couple thoughts. And first, a question for you on wildfire risk, just so I have a understanding of exactly what you mean when you say that, because, you know, that just means like the potential for fire to happen in a given place, right? And the consequences of that. The QRA really brought values into that, that were not just about, say, like communities burning or structures burning, right? There's wildlife, there's timber values and stuff like that that were brought into that QRA assessment, right? So when you say wildfire risk, you're looking at as defined in the QRA and not some other place, right?
That's correct. Yeah, and it starts with the values and then looks at the burn probability on those values.
Right.
And then the values are actually weighted already.
Right.
And so we're taking the top 4 ENDC based on all of that analysis that we had nothing to do with.
I just think it's like important to note, for example, the Forest Service and their wildfire crisis strategy that they just put out are just looking at structures as values, and they're prioritizing fire sheds based on the probability of fire burning structures, right? So there's just different risk assessments out there, and maybe we want to use the QRA. It seems like that's fine, but I know there's some different thinking on that. And then just on the scale of things, I do worry about if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority when I look at this map. And, you know, these are all just watersheds, right? Obviously, not every acre in the watershed would be treated. But gosh, that's a lot of the state. And you look at, you know, where Washington ended up, I forget what it was, 1.5 million acres or something like that for priority treatments. You know, you add 3 zeros onto that, still a lot of money to treat that amount of acres, probably. So I just think I'm looking at 30 million acres, or yeah, something like that. You know, half the state is like 30 million acres or something. So that's just it's a couple orders of magnitude more landscape you're looking at. So I think it's not much of a prioritization if it ends up like that much.
Well, and this is part of the question that I had too about ownership. Are we ownership agnostic when we're identifying lands for priority treatments and investment? Or are we looking at non-federal, for example, that acreage number may get a lot smaller? Do we include industrial non-federal? Do we include state only lands? You know, that's another way to sort of skin the cat and prioritize acres. So I think Joseph's question is a really good one.
Well, can I add one thing to that, Susan Jane, would be operability. You know, I noticed a lot of this, like, I just happen to know where the Kalmiopsis is on this map. And I mean, maybe there's, you know, prescribed fire or something you could do in there, but yeah, there's a bunch of watersheds that are prioritized that don't have any access at all. And you couldn't really do treatments there per se. So just wondering about, you know, drilling down into like, well, what's practical to treat as well. That might actually really limit the map a bit.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point in terms of the sort of capacity and readiness aspect of it. Some of these places may not be possible to do even with all the money we might have, just because there's not the there's not the ability to do it, or the NEPA hasn't been done there, or something like that. That's where you have to sort of do some pre-work in order to make that happen. We haven't yet kind of gotten to that level yet, but it is still there's a lot probably a lot of nuance here to dive into that needs to be done in the near future. Amanda?
Yeah, just really quick, Joseph, that you made me think of something in relation to this work, and that has to do with timeline. And this idea about how much is prioritized. Obviously, we're looking at a 20-year strategic plan. Should that include phases? Thinking about highest need, and we kind of talked about this at the last meeting in relation to capacity, and where there is capacity and where there might already be planned treatments, where there isn't, but where there's maybe opportunity now, right, in a watershed that the Forest Service is looking at analyzing and things like that, or if there's a way to insert some of this work into something that's currently being scoped. I think we need to be eyes wide open about timeline as well when we're thinking about priority, because that might change how much we prioritize up front, or in how many acres or whatever metric we want to use might get identified in different phases. So 20 years sometimes seems like a long time, sometimes seems like not a long time when it comes to treatments on the landscape and in the natural resource world. But that might be another thing we want to think about is when we talk about prioritizing landscapes, is it prioritizing a whole bunch over 20 years, or is it prioritizing in different phases over that 20 years? Because that, I think, could change at least the way I think about it.
Any other thoughts on that? I like a lot of those thoughts. I think that's really helpful. It spurred a lot of thinking in my own mind.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think again that kind of comes back to what are really the truly high priority areas in the short it's a 20-year plan. So over the 20 years, what's most important that we need to get after ASAP, what can wait a little bit, and what do we maybe need to wait and see about? And I think that once we add some of these other layers around readiness and operability and all that kind of stuff, I do think this stuff's going to start to sort out pretty I mean, I think we can bin that stuff. But we won't know until we give it a go.
Yeah, and I'd just throw I agree. I think with that base map you've got, and then you add some of these other filters around accessibility, operability, readiness, capacity, and then as Amanda said, sort of where are other programs already, where's already work being funded or planned in that area. I think we'll come up with a short list, or I mean, it'll begin to sort out a smaller number of acres. But then I think making sure we do prioritize so that we accomplish the treatments at the scale and needed, that we have a large enough impact on those watersheds to sort of fully implement what we believe is the best available science, so that we can generate an impact. Because the worst thing we could do is sort of spread it all out, dilute, and then people continue to debate whether these treatments are being effective or not.
So, because my mind goes to okay, so what are we going to write in the report, and what would be perhaps phase one? Well, actually, let me stop that for a moment. I see Carl's hand up, so I prefer to him to speak before I do.
Thank you. I've been enjoying the conversation, and it triggered a thought that from that what Niall's talking about is, if you're able early in the first 3 years to go where you have capacity and the ability to get work on the ground, that could then serve as adaptive management for other places to learn from. But I think also one of the goals should be that when you're funding an area, when you essentially walk away from that area, they have the collaborative and the working relationships to then be resilient against future fire, to be able to respond and design treatments and be able to be effective, so that you may only go in and do a focused landscape treatment in certain areas, but the big benefit is that you're bringing people working together, planning together, and this may only fund a portion of that work, but when you leave a community or an area that is now much better served as far as sharing resources and planning and working together.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's great. Where I was going was sort of, this conversation sort of leads me to wonder, in the near term, the phase one, let's call it, if we just focused on the blue areas, would that make sense? Or would we also, do the green and the others sort of like we're in like phase two, once we've got the more nuanced understanding of things, then the green areas would be incorporated, especially as we get the sort of decision support system up and running, and we can sort of think about that in a more nuanced way. And so, and I'm happy for the answer to be no, but I'm just trying to think about like what, from your guys' perspective, what does make sense? Joseph, I see you up first, and then Pete.
Well, I just would have to think more on the forest restoration, the lighter blue stuff. I mean, some of that looks like it might be in some pretty wet forests, Is that really the charge of this group, to restore wet forests that have very low frequency, maybe high severity, but low frequency fire regimes? And I don't know, is the rubric of restoration appropriate to apply, in that way here? But I live down in where we got everything. We're all the dark blue, so we're a high priority either way. And I don't know, maybe Pete, to me, that, because you all put that together, that departure kind of thing, right?
Yeah, yeah, and just to be clear, the blue is not the departure. I think the departure piece is the green. The light blue, that's
Oh, right. I
that's
got
the
you.
QWRA
I
data.
see.
Yeah.
Correct.
But I think your
Yeah,
question.
I got my colors mixed up.
No, but I think your question, yeah, it's a legit question. Because what's also not shown here, and this isn't exactly like question that I wanted to ask, but what's not shown there that's also a part of the DeMayo 2018 update or 2018 departure and needs assessment is that, you know, this is only showing the active treatment needs. There's a ton of forests in Oregon that just need time to grow. Like there's a lot of forest land in the state that, because of past management practices or et cetera, have, you know, are effectively departed from resilient conditions. Back to Amanda's point, I mean, that's what this whole thing is really about. How do you restore landscapes to be resilient? And there are a lot of landscapes in Oregon that need time to grow. And then there are other landscapes that need active types of treatments. And then there are some that need a combination of both. And so what is depicted in green here is purely the active treatment side of things, or the proactive treatment side of things. So just to bear in mind, I think my question that I had actually though was, and it's a little bit back to Joseph's earlier point about the QWRA and what's shown in blue. My concern with just using the QWRA out of the box, in addition to Katie's earlier point about, I know my colleagues within TNC range systems had some significant heartburn about the 2018 QWRA as well, for the same reasons she pointed out. And furthermore, I think using the QWRA out of the box means you're basically buying into the relative importance values that were assigned across the HVRAs, the high value resources and assets. And so what you're going to see here is that effectively, because I think they assigned a relative importance value of 33% to people and property, or where people live, basically, as one of the HVRAs, you're going to end up, you know, effectively giving a lot of weight. And perhaps that's completely okay, right? Like, I'm not criticizing that decision, but that's going to weight some of those watersheds that are in closer proximity to people. And so we just would have to decide, you know, do we like those relative importance values? Because that's going to drive a lot of what these summarized ENVC, expected net value change results, are going to be. And then in other cases, you might, I mean, like, to pick on Susan Jane's house in John Day, like, you know, that's an area that's not going to pop a lot because there's not a lot of people, or up where Nils lives, right? So you just sort of have to take that into consideration. And maybe in those geographies, there's other values that or that regional stakeholders, whether that's in, you know, the Blue Mountains or Southeast Oregon, might want to weight a different set of values slightly differently through those relative importance. So.
Amanda.
Yeah, and I think another thing that Susan Jane brought up in relation to kind of readiness, I think I wouldn't be comfortable making a decision off the cuff with this map. You know, like you said, Dan, should we just focus on the dark blue areas where they both overlap? I don't know that I would feel comfortable doing that without incorporating information about where funding is already moving. So this doesn't incorporate any information about, you know, stuff that's in the planning phase or is getting close to implementation, right? I don't think that we need to continue to double down in these places. Like, for instance, we know that the Deschutes in the area around Bend is getting a ton of investment from the wildfire crisis strategy. It's one of the priority landscapes from the Forest Service. And so, you know, how do we incorporate that information into the decision-making here? Because I'm not saying that that landscape is taken care of now and that it's going to be completely taken care of and never needing additional treatments in the future. That's just not how forestry and natural resource management works. But we need to figure out how we incorporate that into this assessment, because I'm hopeful, at least, that whatever comes out in this 20-year strategy does drive funding and resource prioritization for the state for that period of time. So I don't have an answer right now. And so basically, like I said, I'm not comfortable maybe making a decision until we maybe add a few more of those layers.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you all kind of wrestling with this alongside us on this. We're and we will try to come back next time with more of that information as well and continue to wrestle. Nils?
Thanks. Yeah, I was just following up on Pete's last comment, just sort of about regionally and local values, what people will assign the highest value to. And it reminded me that when we were first working on Wallowa County's, when the National Fire Plan was first released back in whatever it was, 2000, 2001, and we were working on the very first Community Wildfire Protection Plan, it was really clear that the residents of Wallowa County, before they might have even understood the implications of some of these maps and weighted values and everything, were saying that their highest priority was to protect the resource lands. That if their house burned down, they believed at the time, with insurance and whatever, that a house could be built back in 12 to 24 months. But those resource lands, particularly when it comes to the forest, would take decades to recover from a fire, and therefore they wanted a much higher degree of value to be placed on the resource lands as we were considering where we might prioritize treatments and how we might define a WUI and the boundaries of a WUI in Wallowa County. And since then, that's been pretty consistent. That I've heard that across Eastern Oregon, and it makes sense because Eastern Oregon is still, unlike many other places, that the economies are very much tied to the land, to a variety of natural resource jobs, and so that's really, it's extremely important. And since then, I've heard more and more tribes say the same thing, that we need to put more value in protecting the lands and the cultural resources on those lands, including the habitat and actual plants and animals that make up first foods. So that's, I just, again, trying to figure out how we wrestle with that, and that this isn't all just driven by housing stock, I think is going to be important.
Very much appreciate that, Nils. Thank you. Pete?
Yeah, I guess I just, if I could tack on a related point, and that is simply, I think, especially thinking nearer term, there's the capacity and the readiness. There are some just sort of political and policy realities. Where is their NEPA shelf stock? How might you mask out wilderness areas or inventoried road lists like Washington did? Some of these ideas that may be important kind of immediate near-term filters. And one of those additionally, I think that we ought to consider is sort of, where are there irreplaceable values on the landscape? And I recognize that every geography or stakeholder may define what they think of as an irreplaceable value differently, but to the extent that we could assign, or pull individual sub HVRAs or HVRA categories out of the QWRA, rather than just using it sort of out of the box, like all of them aggregated and weighted and by watershed, but actually specifically look at individual values that are effectively irreplaceable, or will not replaceable in our lifetime, or not replaceable under climate change scenarios. I think that would be really important. So, things like maybe really, I'm sort of wondering, Katie, could you pull out, or imagine SageCon, a lot of their threat mapping, their eco-state threat mapping is sort of like identified, like, these are the absolute places we don't want to lose, right? Core habitats, really intact, resilient sage steppe or something like that. in the dry forest context, maybe it's like the remnant old forest that we have left out there. To me, there's sort of like a triage element that would be, I think would be valuable for us to consider in the near term. Like these are the places we really, really want to hold on to, because if we lose them, we don't know we'll get them back, or we certainly won't get them back in our lifetimes, right? It takes 400 years to grow a 400-year-old forest. So I think that's a particularly important one. And then on top of that, I think trying to figure out some way to incorporate climate change and climate change adaptation into that. So looking, at maybe a climate water deficit data set that could allow us to understand where are likely changes in the actual sort of underlying biophysical environment going to come from. Because if there are places where we need to triage, because if we don't and it burns, we're not likely to get forest back or get healthy rangeland back. That would be something for me that would also rise to the top of the list for sort of the near-term triage actions and investments.
Lots of helpful thoughts there. Thank you, Pete. John?
Yeah, I certainly agree with the thought that these resource values that are hard to replace definitely need a high value. But the thing I haven't heard and concerns me, one of the real reasons I'm here, not all WUIs are the same, and there needs to be a certain amount of modeling or some kind of assessment going into finding out where the next Detroit, where the next town of paradise is going to be, and treating those, because these houses out away from town, they've kind of chosen their own destiny. But these towns, when they get burned over, that's a big deal. And one of the reasons we're doing this is so that won't happen again. And that needs to be pretty high on the list, is figuring out the towns that are at risk of a flat total burn over.
I very much appreciate that comment, and what I'm struggling with is like, and do we have a way of doing so?
I think the QRA, did that, right? I mean, there was a list of the towns that were most likely to burn to the ground in a table in that QRA, right? I think Merlin, Oregon is #1 in the state. So yeah, I think you're right.
I'm not familiar with that, but that's I'm glad to hear that there is that data already out there.
Hey, I'm gonna kick in here. A great conversation. We're taking lots of notes. I'm also doing a time check, as I normally do. So I would just kind of offer maybe like last thoughts and comments, and then we'll transition. And part of the transition is two pieces: is the additional financing opportunities, but also with that, looking at what are our federal and state funding sources. Want to look at that to direct it, and then also within that, how do we start mapping those? So I just would offer that the conversation we've had leads into the next conversation. So maybe a last call, Dan, and then we'll transition if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, and Nathan, I haven't actually gotten to the actions part. Do I just table that for next time?
We got about 25 minutes, and we have things we want to talk about. We wanted to talk about additional financing opportunities and timelines. So what I would offer is, if we want to talk about actions, maybe like a 5 to 10 minute conversation and just real well thought out comments, and then we'll transition, because I think the other two we can go through pretty quickly. Does that sound like a good plan, Dan?
Sure. Yeah. If there's other comments on what we've been talking about, this has been really rich and helpful, and I don't want to cut it off.
Yep, exactly.
It appears we have, though. All right, going once, going twice. All right, I'll move on to actions, and we'll probably just revisit this with more data next time. So be prepared for that. All right. All right. So how to define priority actions. So remember, we're prioritizing geographies and actions. And so this is just an initial thinking around priority actions. And what I've done here first is provided guidance from the MOU in 762 about the various things that they've said around actions, which is, you know, reducing wildfire risk, providing analytical science, evaluating varying types of fuel treatment methods, so evaluating sort of things, leveraging the collective power of public-private partnerships, et cetera, to address the underlying causes of wildfire risk, in monitoring, adaptive management, public and private lands, and incorporating best available science and adaptation and mitigation responses to climate change, and other, you know, major ecological and social drivers. So a lot of things in terms of like thinking about where do we, not just where we invest, but what do we invest in, essentially. So with that information, we then, and I think we've talked a little bit about this with you all, we talked with ASIG members, so all the different agencies, about like how they imagine the 20-year strategy would be used in terms of their investments, and how what funding sources and programs essentially would be affected or be sort of influenced by the work we're doing. And this is what came up in terms of various GNA, habitat restoration policies, priorities, projects, future NEPA areas, for example, and collectively coordinating actions and investments, which is something that we had talked about as well. And this includes all of the funding that's coming down through the infrastructure bill and the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the IRA, and so all that sort of new federal funding as well. And so this is just preliminary to start thinking about, priority actions. So this then goes to our strategic elements and thinking about, the various things around wildfire risk, resilience in the face of climate change, aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, local economies, water resources, outdoor education, equity, all these things, we've said are important, and we want to kind of be focusing on those in some way. And so this is to the right. I've kept the strategic elements on the left, so that you can sort of see how they map or don't, the sort of types of actions. And this is my last slide here on this, just to give you a sense of the range of things we're thinking about, not how much or where or what this means specifically, but basically the breadth that we've been thinking about here. And what I would be interested in is your reaction to the breadth, and whether you think that things are missing. And I'll just highlight that we still have some work to do to think about the difference between public, private, and tribal lands, and how to address that question, which I think is really important. And then also how to address equity. And we understand that that is a really important thing. And we have some plans to kind of engage people who have been thinking about this much more and are much more sort of thoughtful about it than certainly I am. And so that we can get incorporate that appropriately into this whole process. But I'm just in the few minutes we have on this, if there's any kind of quick reactions, and we can come back to this next time as well.
Just something quick, Dan. I didn't see in the previous slide any mention of the wildfire crisis strategy that the Forest Service put out. Because to me, that's my understanding is that's exactly how they're spending the infrastructure funding, right? Or did I miss that?
Nathan, actually, do you want to address that? I mean, my understanding was that that was a report, not a program with money and sort of stuff attached to it, but maybe I'm wrong on that.
Well, there is a report, and then there's an implementation plan out of that report that identifies priority fire sheds, which they are beginning to fund, through the IIJA and IRA. But Nathan, what's your take?
We have Brian here as well, so I'd also offer that up if you have any comments, Brian. But within that's one thing that we're looking at mapping is understanding where are those priority fire sheds within the wildfire crisis strategy. So I don't know if I'm addressing it fully, but I'd also just say that as we're kind of going to the next stage of looking at where are we placing the treatments, where are we placing the money, is definitely looking at where are those priority fire sheds. And then I'd also, Brian, if you have any additional thoughts too, I don't want to throw you on the spot, but if you have any additional thoughts, feel free to kick in.
Can you clarify? I had the doorbell ring, so I was away when the question was posed. So my apologies.
I was just saying that I wanted to make sure that, you know, what we're looking at here is consistent with the wildfire crisis strategy, which has an implementation plan, right?
Mhm.
That implementation plan identifies priority area fire sheds. And that's kind of the basis for spending the infrastructure and funding, right? Is that
Yes,
strategy?
yes, absolutely. So there's a nuance there, though. There's the bulk of the funding will go to those priority landscapes, those initially funded landscapes. There is some external funding, though, that is at the discretion of the Forest Service. And so what we try to do as we were allocating that funding was look at, you know, the region prior to the wildfire crisis stuff coming out, did our own risk reduction work on priority landscapes. And one of them was, you know, Southwest Oregon, Central Oregon, and then Central Washington, Okanagan, Wenatchee. And so when the bill funding, so we'll just talk about the infrastructure funding for now, came through, we prioritized those landscapes as well in context of this kind of the same metrics that the fire sheds and everything else were. So we have those investment landscapes getting their program work, but I think we were able to allocate about an additional $12 million outside of those investment landscapes in accordance with a lot of the same values that were reflected in the bill. The IRA funding, again, I think there'll be a subset of selected landscapes and some that'll go broadly more regional to address overarching values across the region. So does that help clarify, or do you?
Yeah, I just
Okay.
totally. I just want to make sure that we have that in mind. This seems important because it's the sort of funnel for the funding.
Yep, absolutely.
John, I'll get you next, and then Carl.
Yeah, thanks. What I want to speak on a little bit to the forest, and especially on the range, doing burns or some of the annual stuff, even standalone grazing is a treatment. But in order to fully use livestock as a tool, we need to be a little more flexible. There's always been a process called temporary non-renewable forage that you can license on the federal agencies, but NEPA and the way it's been interpreted has made it so cumbersome. It's no longer really a flexible tool, and we need to get back to a higher level of flexibility where you can look at an area, decide, as in 2012, the forage was twice the permitted amount, and if you're going to do a burn, you've got to have a little more utilization so that you can control the burn when it gets there, or whatever you might want to do. So we're going to have to look at ways to be a little more nimble in our grazing on our federal permits. And of course, that's a federal conversation, and that conversation is going on, but I did want to throw it out to this group because we might need some support, or there might be creative solutions that it might come to the state to weigh in or something. So I did want to throw that out.
Great, thank you. Carl?
Yeah, just real quick, I was like, you know, when you look at those on the ground treatments, I think one thing maybe to keep in mind as another potential quote unquote treatment would be to basically be keeping more water on the landscape, like large scale floodplain restoration, wetlands that basically are effective fire breaks as well. So it's not always just doing something with the forest, but also looking at how we can keep more water on the landscape to keep it wet.
What? All right, thank you. In the interest of time and not seeing any other hands up, I think I'm going to turn it back to Nathan. And this is just the beginning of this conversation. And I appreciate the thoughts here. And we'll be coming back to you for more of this next time with a little bit more thought behind it. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for all those great comments. We got about 15 minutes, and the last couple pieces that we want to chat about here was the financial opportunities and start to just look at some of that. And then if we have time, we can jump into the timeline for phase 3. So we're going to go ahead and share here. All right. So once again, I just wanted to kind of round the conversation. The way we set this up was to kind of really look at all the pieces together. So once again, we started off with this language, and the last piece of it is to direct federal, state, and private investments in a tangible way. And we talked about the direct versus guide, but wanted to just kind of also look at how is this with the shared priorities and coordinated investments? How are we adequately directing that funding to make sure we're making the best, the biggest impact and using our resources the best that we can. So what we had identified here for kind of the financial aspect of it was looking at identifying existing funding sources, programs, authorities that will be directed by these priority actions and geographies. And then also looking at that is what are the new opportunities? And that's a conversation we wanted to get into is what are the opportunities outside of the federal and state funding sources. And we within the federal and state agencies are good at the federal and state funding sources, but what are those outside of that can help guide these treatments and these investments and these, et cetera. So, and then also linking those existing and new funding to priorities, readiness and capacity, and goals. And conversations that we've had in the past here is how are we effective in making sure that, like I had heard earlier, was in certain areas that are high priority, how are we directing the right money, the right funds in order to create that impact, and not just dumping large amounts of money on an area and expecting a result that isn't quite possible. So, and then on the last piece of it is engaging with the federal and state partners and integrating that into our funding programs and activities and making sure we have those coordinated investments. Once again, I think is really key here within the strategy. And really what I wanted to focus on here with the limited time is starting the conversation of existing funding sources and new funding opportunities. So we had started to put together some preliminary thoughts of how are we understanding these funding sources and just some of the headers of how we're organizing this. So by funding source and program, what is the purpose of that funding that helps us direct that, the host agency, the source, and where does that go, federal, state, and private? We want to know within the shared stewardship context of directing the right funding in the right spaces, and goes back to the conversation of land ownership. If there's an area that's high federal that needs work, well, we need to be directing that federal funding in those spaces, and if there's areas of high state or private, so we need to make sure we have the adequate funding sources going in those spots. And then also the program amount and the project amount and match requirements. So just kind of some general high-level thoughts here. But then also, what are these funding sources? And this goes back to funding sources that have been identified, wanted to get feedback on these funding sources and then any other funding sources. And we may not get into an in-depth conversation, but just wanted to just kind of breeze the topic, and we can dig into it more next time. But some of the big programs within the state funding sources you can see here, and working really closely with OWEB and then the ODF funding sources that can be directed. And then also the conversation of what we're looking at coming back is understanding where have these funding sources been directed in the past and then currently, and how does that overlay with where those priorities are. So looking at bringing some of that information back. And then also with our federal funding sources as well, some of the big programs and the funding that is going through those programs, and how are we adequately directing that funding as well. So just kind of some general information here. And once again, we'll post this PowerPoint on the webpage. I'd recommend spending a little bit more time, and we'll bring this back next time to have a little bit more in-depth conversation along with some, hopefully some information of where these funding sources have been currently being placed and where they've been placed. So working on that, and really outside of that, starting to explore what are those private funding sources, what are those other financing opportunities that we may not be very good at or may not very much know about, and wanted to have that conversation about those additional financing opportunities, and starting to just briefly look at conservation finance, others, and really how does those groups help us start identifying other information. So that's a lot there in a short amount of time. Just wanted to kind of breeze the topic, and like I said, we can dig a little bit deeper, and I recommend looking at some of this in between meetings. But any thoughts or questions or comments on that, or is there something that we're wildly missing that you think that we should be aware of? Pete?
Yeah, this is great. Thank you for quickly kind of highlighting it. One other thought that comes to mind, and it's a little bit perhaps outside the scope of a financial plan per se, but the conversation has come up in several instances now about sort of the need to mix different colors of money, different sources of money in order to get kind of maximum bang for the buck, given limitations of different funding streams. The example that's coming to mind, I guess, to put a more concrete point on it, is sort of the limitations of some of the LRP dollars being tied to a biennium and not having the flexibility then to implement treatments that might come after a mechanical treatment, like getting prescribed fire on the ground or something like that would have to happen after biennium. So the reason I bring it up is I think associated with a financial plan, we might also want to think about what types of agreements need to be in place in order to mix and match those monies effectively, and who we need to kind of light a fire under, so to speak, to get those agreements in place.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you, Pete. Appreciate that. Excellent. Well, I will just propose we'll come back here in kind of the next phase here as we're starting to bring this together and understand the accomplishments and where we're putting the money and some of that stuff, and we'll dig into this a little bit deeper. It would be my proposal for next meeting. And then with that, Dan, do we want to try to do the timeline real quickly? Do you think you get through that, or should we?
Yeah, I can do that in 3 minutes or less.
Okay, just to kind of give a view of what the future looks like. So we'll go ahead and quit sharing here, but really appreciate that kind of quick down and dirty overview of what we're looking at here.
All right, so you guys see my screen. So as you know, we're in this phase 2 here, and move into phase 3, which is drafting the plan. And so I want to just give you a sense of what that we're thinking that would look like. And basically, we've already started thinking about drafting the plan. And as we continue to develop and refine the content, and we're going to be starting with a kind of preliminary, the introductory stuff, and some of the other stuff. And as we develop the content, we'll make that more substantial over time. In March, I think the important things here is that in March, our goal is to present the key components to the tribes, you all, the stakeholders, and the SLG. You won't see the document, but you'll see sort of the overall picture of what we're thinking. We'll get your input. And just like we have all along, and there shouldn't be any big surprises because you've seen us sort of like wrestle with this all along with you. And so what we hopefully will put out is what we've kind of normed towards along the way here. Based on what we get from tribes, from you all, from the SLG on the sort of basic gist of what we're thinking, we'll then refine the document that we've been writing all this time. And the goal here is to put out an initial draft report that we'll review with you all, give you a couple of weeks to read it. And then we'll have a conversation about it. And then we'll take your comments, both in verbally and written, and then we'll revise in May and send back to you a revised report that hopefully is close to sort of maybe 95% good by that point. And we'll take additional sort of comments and such, and we may need to have individual conversations if there's like pieces that where a certain perspective is not getting represented appropriately. We'll sort of figure out how to make sure that we get this right, with the goal of getting a final report endorsed by the strategic leadership group by June, and then releasing that and really beginning implementation, even though in many ways implementation is already happening to some degree, and it will sort of continue to be happening as sort of different timelines occur with funding sources and things like that. So this is, there's a lot more detail behind this, but this is sort of the goal that we have over the course of the next 6 months or so. Noting also that we've got presentations with the Board of Forestry on January 4 and with the OWEB board on the 25th of February. And there's opportunities for additional touch points with all these different groups and things along the way. So just wanted to give you a sense of what we're thinking. If you've got thoughts and observations or suggestions, very much open to those. Otherwise, I'll turn it back to Nathan.
Looks like
Amanda, I see that your hand is up.
Yep.
Yeah, just really quick on the January Board of Forestry meeting. I assume that we will not be meeting before that. So what exactly are you going to be presenting at that January meeting, Nathan?
Yeah, just we're looking at presenting this, just kind of an update of where we are to inform the background, the kind of the overview and where we're going. So essentially, all the information that's been presented over these last 4 meetings, all the slides that we've seen, and incorporating that feedback. So no final report, but just kind of the status update to let that group know where we are.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I just wanted to be, I just wanted to know what I'm going to end up seeing in the board packet.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, great question. Any other questions or thoughts there? All right. Well, I'll go ahead and close this out. We're hitting that 4 o'clock hour. I know folks are either heading to the next one, heading home, or heading to happy hour. So I'll go ahead and close this out. Once again, as always, I just want to just appreciate everyone's feedback. Got a lot of good notes. As you can see, we incorporate that, and we want to bring a lot of this information back to the group next time. So we'll go ahead and do that and kind of download from what we heard and incorporate that information. Just once again, a special shout out to y'all for taking the time and providing the comments. As always, appreciate that. And then for Dan and for Sean and others for helping co-present, and for Brian being here, really appreciate that as well. So our next meeting is January 10th. We'll throw out an agenda and information heading into the holidays. If anyone has any questions, comments, etc., please reach out. As always available. So just want to throw that out there. And if not, just have a great holiday and really enjoy some time off. And we'll get back after it in 2023. So once again, thank you, and y'all take care.